I do want to talk this time about living. So often in conferences on spirituality, psychology, depth psychology therapy, we talk the whole time about getting somewhere, but never what it's like after we arrive. So we wanted to close with examples and discussion and questions and comments from you about what it is like to live in relation to the transcendent. What is life like then? And one of the very encouraging things, at least encouraging to me, I find developmental theory so discouraging because I'm always at the wrong stage at the wrong time. It wounds me. But what's encouraging about the spiritual masters is they do say, yes, do your practice, 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 practice. But they also say, you never know when it's going to happen. Dogen, the 13th century Zen Buddhist, Chinese Zen Buddhist, says, even the beginner, right away, can drop body and mind. So if we dropped body and mind, if we were living in this conversation between the depth and the surface mind, if we were living in conversation with the ego as the center of consciousness, in conversation with what transcends itself and what transcends the whole psyche, what would that be like? What would it be like? It would be like this, that whatever we need, any of us, all of us, each of us, we learn from the psychology people, particularly Jung, who spent an awful lot of time in conversation with religion, and for whom, I would add, God was an objective reality that transcended the psyche, was not reduced to the unconscious. It would mean that each of us, every person, has in him or her, in that deep down place that spirit is digging up, that which is needed, that which is one's own access to the ultimate primordial ground of being, that which is the access to one's experience of God. Marie-Louise von Franz, a disciple of Jung, says, each person has an opening at the deepest level of his psyche where something eternal can flow in. Now, if it flows in, and if we're able to receive it, then what? What's the result? The result is not products. It's not a book. It's not a baby. It's not a career, a degree, a job. It's not even health. It's not even peace on earth. It's certainly not wealth or fame. These are all very precious images, realities that we craft around which our life revolves. These might even be our dearest values, some of them. But these are byproducts. We're glad to have them, but they're not it. What is it? It's livingness. It's being alive, feeling it in your body tissues, even if you're ill and dying. You can still feel yourself near the pulse of life. You can still see it freshly. Whether you're poor, whether you're mentally ill, whether you're in a war-torn country. How else would we explain simple acts of kindness even in concentration camps? Livingness has no borders, no boundaries. It's a beat, it's the swing, it's the jazz, it's the quiet, still voice that we can hear regardless of our state of mind or body. It's available. It's offered. So that's the first thing. That's what allowed a John of the Cross to write those erotic poems, those liquid poems about union in the dark with the beloved in this terrible cell where he couldn't sit up or stand up. That's what allows an Etty Hillesum, who's a very contemporary person, even though she died in the Second World War in one of the camps. She was a young student studying philosophy, riding her bike. She had a lover. She quarreled with her parents. She had a community of friends. She was in Holland. And as the country became occupied, and then there was a deportation camp, and then the Jews were sent off to Auschwitz, and she among them, she discovered, even under those terrible circumstances, everything closing down, closing in, she said, I've become a kneeler in training. My head grows heavy, and I find I have to step inside some walls of prayer. She spoke of God as living in a well deep inside her, always available, but grit and bricks and rocks would come in and cover it up, and her job was to dig God out again. And finally she thought, in the most extreme circumstances, that her job was to protect this place of God dwelling inside her. That was her devotion. That was her service. Nothing can take you away from us, she said, or wrote. So there is this availability of God in each of us. That's the first thing. The second is that it's not products. It's livingness. It's being alive, plugged in. The third is a rather renegade notion, but I do believe it. And it comes out of 3 decades or more of clinical work and teaching. I don't think, as some of the depth psychologists say, that we become whole. I don't think we do. I think there is the urge, Jung would call it the urge toward individuation, to become your own most self, all that you can become. But I don't think we achieve wholeness. I think what happens instead is that you discover you're a part of a greater wholeness. All of us are parts of a greater wholeness. It's like a Mondrian painting. You're just a little red blob down in the bottom. You're not the whole painting yourself. And you need your neighbor, the yellow blob, and the blue one, and the black line, and the white, to make the whole construction. I think wholeness is a dear, valuable, precious human concept. It does give us hope in our struggles. But I don't think it's achievable for individuals, except as they see themselves as part of a greater wholeness. Wholeness is a fugitive concept. I've come to think of it as our egos whistling in the dark, thinking, yeah, I may be a mess now, but give me another 10 years. Watch out. It doesn't work that way. We are never the ones who are whole. We're the sinners who are living in exile. We're the ones in bondage in Egypt. We're the ones who are disobedient to Allah's spirit. We're the ones who are mixed up with the 10,000 things. It is whole. And we're the parts. What that whole is calls us to construct whole living on earth, gathering all the parts inside of ourselves and gathering together in the body, what I said last night, in definite form, the form of each individual life, the form of each body politic, and the form of the mystical body of Christ, which knows no bounds. We are not the possessor of wholeness. We're only the parts. And in clinical work, you can feel this in the most ordinary session, that between the other person and oneself, there's a full range of significance. It embraces nothing less than all of reality itself. It's not that you and the other are all of reality, but when it works well, all that matters is living right here, the livingness right here. One could say the same of a moment with one's child, or with a worshiping moment, or in a sermon. It's that sort of thing that allows us to go on doing the work we do year after year after year. So again, as I previewed last night, it changes our sense of ethics and responsibility to each other. It is not helper to helpee. It's two people held in something larger that overflows in each, to each, through each, to the other, beyond the self. The interdependence of all the pieces to make up the whole. That's what's needed. And then an admission, which I will take up the second time around, of how necessary but how relative our ego is.
Livingness is an attempt I made as a word which Anne has developed so handsomely to render a German, Wilhelm Dilthey's Erlebnis into English. It's very hard to get hold of in any language. The great Spanish philosopher José Ortega y Gasset, who was trained much of his philosophical apprentice life in Germany, coined a word which has now become part of the Spanish language, vivencia, to try to get that living on and on and on. And it seems to me, however clumsy it may sound, livingness is the closest we can come to it. It's like the point I was trying to make about willingness as against will. It's a present participle with the sense of the ongoing, which is itself a present participle. But it is now, in the deepest sense, fixed in place, as the great nouns are. Parts of speech are not simply nuisances in education at the lower level. They define the life we live, the livingness we permit ourselves, the answers to the summonings which come again and again, not simply from out there, not simply through diagramming sentences or trying to learn a foreign language and its curious habits, but from that extraordinary inner conversation where human possibility is defined. It's not always easy to hear. It may become a positive clamor, a noisy pursuit, especially if we're not equipped or won't equip ourselves to hear it. But if we do, we will find ourselves on a path, in an alley, even in a sense in a lane beneath the sea, going somewhere we know not where because it has no final destination. I've done 2 gatherings of material, one based on the other, on death, to learn that it's in contemplation of death we find livingness. Not death as a terminus. That kind of death is a failure to live. But death as something evoked in the exploration of being which is becoming, which is itself not being as an end, but as an ongoing beingness. To follow that alley, path, lane is to take the attitude, Anne has used Agatha Christie, which we all know from stories, novels, films, from which the mystery story flows. That focus on what is missing. But there can be no epilogue at the end of this because we don't come to its end. The end is how we have moved. The end is what is there from the beginning. The end is when we give up the constant fear with which so many have visited, that we may not matter at all, any of us. Worst of all, individually, me, I, you. But in fact, we do matter. We are. And if we are, we have somehow been found worthy. I don't care if it's only a confluence of some accidental meeting of sperm and egg. We have been granted being. For me, as a matter of faith, every granting of being has purpose. Even if it's only that general purpose of which Kant made so much, which is the, again, ness word, purposiveness, without purpose, without a message, without a direct end in view. A sense of purpose which doesn't say, I am here so that 2 months from now, 6 years from now, at the end of my term on earth, I will have amounted to the following. You cannot know that. You should not know that. What you should know is what is to me the greatest proof of the existence of God. You are known. Not St. Thomas's proofs of God, not any of the traditional proofs seem to me to be more than a kind of reconnoitering of faith. We've been there before, we confirm it. But this is not going back to say, yes, okay, this does prove it, has a mathematical exactness. There is no mathematical exactness in this area. There is a deeper certainty that cannot be translated into algebraic symbol or calculus operation. It is, we are known. And we know that we're known when we scour our insides and go beyond the frontiers of consciousness into the depths where we may meet unconsciousness. When we find that we are connected in some way, however obscure, however illusory at times, to what really matters, to a center. And then we know not only that we are connected to what matters, we know that we do matter. That is to be alive. Short life, long life. That doesn't matter. What matters is how it has been lived. And it is always lived by attention to the day, to the moment. Of all the mystics, I've taught courses over the years in the history and example of mysticism, examples, so many of them. But no one captures me more than the man who left us only one real statement of his experience, Blaise Pascal, in the 17th century. Who great mathematician, logician, scientist that he was, and man of faith, notated the time of the existence of this experience. He carried around afterwards always a little parchment which he had sewn into his doublets, into his shirts. His memorial, his recording of what occurred. And he says from about 10:30 at night until about 12:30. Yeah, that's marvelous. If you've met God, it might be worth keeping a calendar notation of it. And what does he say? He says from about 12:30 at night until about 12:30, 10:30 to 12:30, fire. And then he says, God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, not of the philosophers and learned, God of Jesus Christ, my God and your God will be my God. Forgetfulness of the world and of all except God, grandeur of the human soul. He knew what he was talking about. He knew he had been unfaithful. He says of Jesus, I have fled, renounced, crucified him. And yet he says with that marvelous, indomitable willingness, livingness, let me never be separated from him. That is the power of this concession to life, this claiming of the self and its container, the ego. This recognition that it makes no difference that we are all so different each from the other. That same Ortega I mentioned defines it wonderfully well. He says, what we have in common is our differences. Dwell on that for a while. Each of you sitting next to somebody else, you're different. Twins, identical twins, they're different. This is the contemplative strength of that collectivity, which is the spirit that rests on the infinite variety of being and sees all of it as related. The poet Rilke does it all in 3 words. He brings it all together. For me, it's a supreme moment. I know it's not a greatly quoted one. I know it's not a line you may want to return to again and again, but I do. He says, Du Nachbar Gott, you thou neighbor God. That's the person he's always sitting next to. God's his neighbor. He's there. If that's true, then of course we matter. We are alive. And we recognize that we're alive, and we recognize that we have been thought worthy of being alive because we have been granted in revelation after revelation the analysis in detail of what it means to be alive, simply because we have been brought into contiguity, close to other people, all the colors of art, all the sounds of music, all the textures and graces of nature, the states of being which define life. This is where we come, it seems to me, beyond argument, which doesn't mean that others won't argue about it. I won't. To what the Spirit really is, that community. I remember years ago I did not keep the record that Pascal did of the day, of the hour. But when I read Coleridge, the poet, writing in the marvelous book called Aids to Reflection, about a preacher who moved him very much, what was his Trinity, his Coleridge's. God the Father was ipseity, that which is itself in itself, from the Latin ipso. And God the Son, which was otherness, Jesus, who is the other, who is everything that we meet when we meet, starting with ourselves, the otherness in ourselves. And then everything else, which is the Holy Spirit, which for Coleridge was community. That gave more meaning for me to the word community, which has been an abysmally misused word much of the time. I'm sick of hearing politicians use it. I'm sick of the appeal to community, which simply means vote for me. I am moved instead by the idea that we find ourselves with others, and only with and in others. There's an ancient Jewish proverb that's very simple. The other's material needs are my spiritual needs. That's the best politics, the best social doctrine I know. Not my death, but the deaths of others. Which is why when Dante opens the great Commedia, which remains for me the single greatest work of art we have in literature, he starts with the plural, the first person plural, before he comes to the first person singular, before he comes to himself who is undertaking this journey. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura. In the midst of the journey of our life, I found myself, and he goes on, in a dark wood, the straight way through which was smarrita, messed up, impossible to get and find easily. That's not just a convention. It certainly isn't the editorial we. It's our life because my life, your life is our life. There is no life for anybody that isn't a life with others. Livingness is living with people. We confirm our life in others. And transcendence begins in the nearness of others and the other. What finally really is creation? It's bringing everything that is there, insofar as we can manage it, and we can always manage more than we think, to touch us, where with the senses of the soul we can savor it, taste it. Emmanuel Levinas defines creation as pastness par excellence, the summum bonum of all history. It's these tenses that are so important. I've emphasized them again and again because that's where we find that we are and should be. And revelation is the presentness of the present. And redemption is tension toward the future. Alertness, gathering all that vibrates in us, even if it's only for another second. Dante, in the depth of his deep love of livingness, grants forgiveness to the most abysmal of sins and sinners up to the last split second. He's not living out a theology. He's living in a life.
Now, if we're living in the life, if we're gathering all those parts, it does include the mad parts as well. And those are the ones we usually want to exclude and stumble over. But the mad parts have a very special place. As I said last night, they are the unlockable doors. Those are the parts of us, our wounds, our problems, those problems and wounds that don't heal. They're the parts of us that we never really master, that we never really conscript into the ego's power to dispose of. They go on bleeding, but they're always open, and we always can be reached through them, so that they have a special place spiritually. We never own them. We're never master or mistress there. There we're always accessible. That's a humbling reality, but it reinforces the notion that deep down in us, not just the good parts that we've grown and developed, but the parts we would find bad, ungrown, malformed, undeveloped, they have a place, an honored place, for there we can always be reached. If we accept that, then it means in an ordinary spiritual practice that goes on over decades, and certainly in clinical work that reaches depth, something changes about the place of the ego. It does become relativized. It doesn't become knocked out. Jung has a wonderful terse phrase that the ego is the receiver and the transmitter of the self being the center for Jung of the whole psyche, conscious and unconscious. The ego's like a telegraph operator. Has to be there to get the news from the frontier, has to be there to register the dream or register the wound. But it's no longer center stage. And the move from center stage to the side of the stage is very stressful. In clinical work, it is, as I mentioned in answer to a question earlier, it often starts a regression where one has to go back to find what one lost at an earlier phase in one's life. Or one has to go down into a less conscious, unconscious, before conscious state, to go under a split before the split happened. There's no way to cross this Grand Canyon in my personality. I'm pushed by my psyche to find another route down. Down at the bottom, maybe the river isn't so wide and I can wade across. But what that feels like to me, to my ego that's used to thinking, well, there is somebody there, somebody's home who can do X, Y, or Z, it feels very frightening. It feels really fearful. It's to fall into the hands of the living God, because you feel you're not only going to the place where you're weakest, it's the muck of the stable where the Christ figure is born. It's the ass on which Christ sits that you now know who yourself to be. It's very upsetting to one's amour propre. But worse than that, you can feel unable, poor, weak, even ill. For you may have to go so far that you lose the sense of the certainty and confidence in the thought forms and the way your images are composed by an ordinarily developed, grown-up sense of I-ness, ego. It can feel like going out of your mind. This happens in some clinical work. It doesn't always happen. The analyst may not be capable of it, or the match may be wrong, or one may not be able to get any therapy, or one may not be able to afford any therapy. The other problem is that as a grown-up coming in as the client sees very well the foibles of the analyst, the therapist. They know perfectly well this person's an idiot in certain aspects of her life. So they don't have the lavishness of a child, where you can cover all the weaknesses of the other, which you do perceive lucidly, with loving them. So the thought of being utterly dependent on this fool is really quite daunting. And everything in you resists it, like a dog going to the bath. All four legs are out. See? So what to do? I think here spirituality has a great deal to offer to the clinical work, because it has another view of this, of what is called technically regression. As I said earlier in answer to the question briefly, this is an arrival from a spiritual point of view. This is what partly all the practice is for, to get you disidentified with your sense of I-ness and your familiar ways of working and your ego in center stage. Your helping helper ego is to get you disidentified with that, to drop body and mind, as Dogen says. I'm nobody. Are you nobody too? As Emily Dickinson says. It's to arrive at the 0 point, the becoming like a child, not becoming a child, becoming like a child, what Paul Ricoeur, the philosopher, calls the second naivete. For there the ego is made empty, empty of its confidence and identification with everything that it knows, is, does. Jung says of it, every individual human being who wishes even to approach his own wholeness knows very well that this means bearing his own cross. But the eternal promise For him who bears his own cross is the Paraclete, the Spirit. So the ego is essential, but it must move over, and it's the moving over that's so hard. It's just moving over to stage right or stage left. It's just out of the spotlight. Religion helps because it says, yes, that is. It names it. That's an arrival. That's arriving at an empty place where what comes from the holy side can come across the gap. You don't do it anymore. One woman getting to this place had the most wonderful dream. She said, I turned around and my garden had bloomed behind my back. I hadn't done anything to it, and it just was in bloom. Or another dream, one of my favorites. And you see the homey imagery of these dreams. Often, though, dreams at this point are abstract symbols or primordial figures, dinosaurs, things like that, things quite far from the human. But this one is very accessible. This was also a dream of a woman. She says, Fred Astaire is beginning to dance to the music, and he asks, where is God? And I yell out, in your feet. It's a wonderful dream. So where is the ego in these dreams? There's a dream ego. There's a woman who's got her back to her garden. There's the dreamer who sees God in Fred Astaire's feet. The ego gets it, but the ego is not it. The ego is called to witness it. A man said, of his experience here, I found myself under regard. I found myself under regard. There was something else that was the subject, and he was the witness to that. Now, when one lives in that place, the new comes in almost every day. It's full of gladness and gratitude. One is moved in perceiving how much is generously given by reality, by God. The other thing that religion adds to this is it says, let's name this it. Religion rescues this conversation at this deep level into a personal conversation. This is God. This is Jesus. This is Allah. This is Buddha. This is. All the personal, group, traditional names we give to God. As von Franz, Jung's disciple, says, look, you can't talk to a ball of fire. And you can't, and if you think of carrying on a spiritual life, it can't be anonymous. You can't just say, hey, you. You don't even do that to your dog or your cat. There has to be a name, and religion names it and insists that you name it. And this is what stirs one's heart to gladness, regardless of one's circumstances. They're not repressed. They're not denied. You're not hopping over them. You've gone down into the midst of what is there and what is not there in your life. And lo, the new comes in there. One really small example from my own life. I was so surprised. It's such a small example, it's embarrassing to give it, but it really touched me. I was laboring my way through First Chronicles, which was a big labor. It's rules and regulations and begats and and then there's this big surprise at the end. And what it talks about at the end is what livingness is like. Then the people rejoiced, for they found they offered willingly with perfect heart, they offered willingly. We were strangers. We were sojourners. Our days on earth are numbered. Our days on earth are as a shadow, and there is none abiding. All comes of thine hand. All is thine own. And they did eat and drink on that day with great gladness.
Finally, we come, as we all must come, whether we give it the name or not, to prayer. We've talked about it, we've talked around it, but let us, in these last moments of this meeting together, talk to it. Who prays and to whom? Whether one prays to a God one knows by image or thought, clear, unmistakable, or some abstraction of being itself, or something yet nothing, or simply the hope that there may be something. What we do, however we find our way to it, whatever we call it, whatever gestures or movements, verbal or not, towards something, we express that complexity. This is ancient and very sound theology. We express that complexity which defines us as God's being is defined as that which is not complex. To say simple is not good, especially not in English, because simple may mean foolish. The ancient distinction is a good one between the complex and the simplex. God has no parts. But God knows and loves our parts. We have so many parts, higher and lower parts. And constantly in both sets of parts, we're tempted to feel we have made some colossal mistakes and missed the higher and always chosen the lower, not realizing that choosing the lower is often to have lived the higher, because we've accepted our limitations. We've said we do make enormous mistakes. We're very good at that. But we don't accept that making mistakes is one of the strategies of survival. If we did everything right all the time, we'd be in Congress. We'd be a CEO in some impossible corporation. We wouldn't be alive. What defines us better than our goofings? That's the complexity which is always choosing from that great bundle of variables which we are. Constantly called upon to rise from the ashes. Each of us is destined to be a phoenix. We're always making a mess and we're always cleaning up. You don't like it? Well, then you don't want to be alive. The bodily functions require it. You think you could have devised a better way? Bring me a blueprint sometime. I'd love to see a better one than our systems of digestion and the blood system and the circulation of ideas, where we match the dark night of the soul with the dark night of the body. And if we have the courage, recognize that we're not driven to a definable end. There's a marvelous moment in the letters of the French novelist Gustave Flaubert. He says, yes, stupidity consists in wanting to reach conclusions. We are a thread and we want to know the whole cloth. That's lovely. That's the best we can be, but what a marvelous thing to be a thread. What if we were not even a thread, but just the hole where the thread once was? We can know much. We can feel much. And in the knowing and feeling, know what we don't feel. And move somehow to gather from the pieces, the many pieces, some of that creative imagination which defines us. My great old friend Lewis Carroll had such a moment. "I can't explain myself, I'm afraid, sir," says Alice to the caterpillar, "because I'm not myself, you see." "I don't see," says the caterpillar. "But you see, it's only we, like Alice in Wonderland, who can see that we are not ourselves." Caterpillars are marvelous, especially when they change and fly away. But they can't really see this, and I give great credit to all the levels of life. But we have been is a form of fulfillment. All you must do is move toward it. Some years ago I gathered the prayers of St. Augustine, which appear in all sorts of odd works and sermons, in the great set of confessions, in his soliloquies, and just a couple of them point to what I'm talking about. The greatest of them, which I made, that is to me at least, the epigraph for the book, comes from his commentary on John, and he says simply and straightforwardly, speaking for God, and he had the audacity, and he had, what's even more important, the right to speak for God. He said, "He that believes in me goes into me, and he that goes into me has me." That should be on samplers over everybody's bed. You can go into God, and then you have him. You don't go into God because a telegram has come down that says you may now enter. You don't go into God even because you have been granted the marvel that Pascal was, or John of the Cross, or others more recently. You do it because you keep moving back toward God. One of the great mystics of this century, not sufficiently noted, was a poet named Max Jacob, one-time roommate of Pablo Picasso. Became a wonderful poet and a splendid writer. A Jewish Breton, which is almost impossible to believe, was trained for a world he could never enter to do some work in the French colonies, and took a law degree, and then became a painter and a poet. And one day he came home to his apartment, and there on the wall was a picture of Jesus, and out of the picture came Jesus and spoke to him. And he told a priest about it, and he said, the priest said to him, no, that could not be. We don't see Jesus anymore. Not done, you see. But Max did it and felt it and knew it. And for his pains, he was finally gifted with the star, the yellow star, because he had been born Jewish. And he died in a camp en route to one of the concentration camps. And there's a picture of him there. He looks a little bit like Charlie Chaplin, his feet splayed, and grinning. Not foolishly, but acceptingly. He lived. Livingness was his vocation. He says about God, it's his proof. He says you back up, and you back up some more, and you keep backing up until finally you come to God. That's what we're talking about. Your voice is joy, says Augustine. Give me what I love, for I do love, and this love you gave me. In one simple way, it's a child simplicity, it's a mystic simplicity, it is the truth of being alive. You say what you say because you know it's there and you can say it, and it's not only safe, it is right to say it. You're backing up in that kind of talk. that kind of imagery, that kind of feelingness to where you came from. Another man, a contemporary, Garrett Moore, writing on prayer, a monk, says that God is the one I am when I am with nobody. Have we that much trust? That's what the question is. Can we accept such a fullness of conviction that we can allow the imagination its richest fields and keep planting in it the flowers that have no end of growth, no season, no finality, because life has no finality? That's what we're being told. There is a statistic here about prayer that is really fascinating. In a journal I edit called the Journal of Religion and Health, with which Anne works with me, I had an article I was delighted to print, the collaboration of a scientist and a theologian. And they had assembled what was known insofar as there were knowable statistics about prayer, which prayers worked and which did not. These are not overwhelming statistics, but by an unmistakable, if narrow, statistical fixedness, prayers 2 and 4 plants are more successful than all other prayers. That's God's sense of humor. But it's also right. So walk softly the next time you pass that plant that's been giving you so much trouble and won't grow, and say a quick one, whatever your favorite prayer may be. Even because this is also a kind of prayer, grow, you idiot! And somebody will hear you. There is an angel of growth that responds, the angel that stands over each of us, which is the angel for each of us, for we each have angels in this sense, some direct connection. We'll keep backing up. We'll keep trusting. We'll keep saying these firm prayers, even if they're only a form of cursing, but they're cursing with faith. The best way I know to sum this up is the way Eliot sums it up at the end of Little Gidding. He's been standing night after night, watching the planes over London. And he's been thinking about all the difficulties. And he knows that there is torment in life, and then he says, who then devised the torment? And he answers, love. Love is the unfamiliar name behind the hands that wove the intolerable shirt of flame. He's thinking of the way Hercules was betrayed by Nereus in that wonderful old myth, which human power cannot remove. We can only live, only suspire, consumed by either fire or fire. You either think you're going up and then go to hell, or you know you're going down and then survive forever. That's what he's saying. And let me read these last lines. Let us read these last lines together. You'll hear them and think them and feel them. They're lines in which he sums up the medieval elements, which are the only true elements. The periodical table of elements is what was devised by a stupid chemistry teacher on a bad day. Maybe you didn't take chemistry. They're useful, but they're useful in the way that a weather map is useful. You know for how long that is. Earth, air, fire, water. He reverses them and gets to fire at the end. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Through the unknown remembered gate, when the last of earth left to discover is that which was the beginning. At the source of the longest river, the voice of the hidden waterfall. and the children in the apple tree. Not known because not looked for, but heard, half heard, in the stillness between two waves of the sea. Quick now, here now, always, a condition of complete simplicity, costing not less than everything. And all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Those are two lines from the great 14th century lady of ladies, Lady Julian of Norwich. All shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. When the tongues of flame are infolded into the crowned knot of fire, and the fire and the rose are one. What he's saying is his version of Baudelaire's tremendous aperçu that all things are equal to each other. We may be sad that we've lost the great universal set of symbols, but it's lost. We no longer live in that world. Though that world is part of our world, the pastness which is creation. But we have that marvelous sameness which is in all of us. Anne's snakes of this morning. In Baudelaire's construction, every hair on every head is a snake, and every river is every hair. And if you join that to Jared Manley Hopkins, see, not a hair of the head is lost. Very, very pleasing for those of us who've lost more hairs than we like to think. Then you see that the fire and the rose really are one. We have time for some questions, comments, whatever pleases.
I don't have a question, and I don't have a question mostly because I wouldn't want an answer. I just wanted to be the first up, to carve out some space to hold the mystery that you've brought us to the edges of. I had the image along the way of standing on Mount Pisgah and seeing the promised land as Moses did and being told, there you will not enter. Knowing that I can't grasp all your words, I can't grasp all your thoughts, I can't grasp all your beauty, but you bring me to that edge. And before we dissect it, I just want us to have a moment of protecting it.
You're very generous. Thank you very much. Even there, I sometimes like to point out God's sense of humor. You remember when Moses comes to get the Ten Commandments? I tell this often because I laugh at it all the time. Remember when he's finished? And he says to God, well, they'll ask me, where did this come from? Who? What? And God says, answering where this comes from, with that impossible Hebrew copula, Yahweh. Where did it come from? From him who is, or I am who am. He's a low vaudevillian, God is at times. He says you ask the ridiculous question to which the only answer is a ridiculous answer. And it is. I mean, what you're saying, which is so touching, is there are times when we can simply allow ourselves to feel and not expect an answer. And you were very good to put it that way.
Thank you.
I'm glad you did that, because I did feel a little weird asking a question, because it's such a profound and powerful evening and day. But something that struck me during the discussion today that I wondered if you might just address a little bit of is the concept of really coming to know ourselves in relationship with another. And yet also, at least from my own personal experience, I'm very familiar with the need to be alone and go down into the depths and make that journey into the underworld. I'm just curious, how would you address the paradox? Because it seems that it does require both elements, but also a couple of us have observed just your lovely interaction together. So I just wonder, as a partnership too, if you might just address the issue of aloneness as well as togetherness in our own personal growth and spiritual development.
Each gets better with the other. It's easier to be alone if there's a near neighbor who loves you and wants to find out what news you've brought from the frontier. And it's easier to be with the other if you're not feeling you have to be the other, or the other has to be you. The space of conversation in oneself between the surface and the depth is the same space. It's like the same space, the space between you and the one you're most close to. The other can see depths in you that you didn't know were there. I think of a smaller example of this. One's siblings always know one's shadow. If you're ever in doubt, just ask your sister or brother or cousin, the roommate you never got along with. Well, the one who loves you knows your best self in a way you don't, so that this witnessing, where I believe one ends up in the livingness, is that one becomes a witness to the livingness. The one who loves you witnesses to you in ways you can't see yourself, I would think. What do you think?
Well, that splendid question rings a change on we are known, which I think Anne's been pointing to. If any one of us accepts the fact that we are known, we have a chance of finding someone else who will know us. There is a preparation. There's not the preparation of wild fantasies or impossible dreams, because this is in the realm of marvelous possibility and even probability. But it starts with that absolute conviction. We are known. If we think we are neither known nor knowable, the chances are we're right to a certain degree. Nobody will come and take a chance on trying to know us. So that question, that sort of two-part approach to it, starts with going down into oneself and saying, I'm worth knowing, even if only by myself. And then the marvel is somebody else will join that self. It's full of delights that you cannot imagine, along with many difficulties. I mean, I'm an impossible punner and play with these things. Anne says you can't be you, but she can because I am be you. Those are my initials. And we play on it all the time. It's childish, but you see, you are, when you go into yourself, restored to your childhood. I give this corny example because that's part of the greatness of this reality that you pointed to.
I just have a very simple story, a true story I would like to share. I think you will agree that it resonates with so much of what has been said here yesterday and today. It has to do with a friend of mine who rode a bus to downtown Indianapolis and was scurrying across town to get the second bus she needed to get wherever she was going. She was scurrying along with a friend, and she came upon what appeared to be a hump of rags moving towards her. She wasn't sure if it was a man or a woman. She passed them by and had gone a half a block perhaps and said to her companion, you know, I really wish I'd stopped and spoken to them. And he made some comment. She said that probably 3 times before he said, well, it's not too late. She made a U-turn, hurried back to this, whom she found out to be a woman, and she said to her, may I buy you breakfast? And the woman said, I'm not hungry. And my friend said, how about a cup of coffee? She saw in her cart an empty coffee cup, and she said, may I replace your coffee? And she said, no, thank you. always with a sweet, sweet smile. My friend said, "Is there anything I can do for you? I really would like to help you." And the woman said, "Would you hold my hand?" And out from the rags came this warm hand, and my friend stood on the street and held her hand.
Thank you.
I appreciate everything you said. I want to challenge you. I want to throw out a challenge. And when I'm going to maybe criticize, you've got me to think about it, so it's not like I can really criticize you, okay? But that's all an introduction to say. When we're talking about the senses of the soul, I was thinking maybe the images, we would all do images a different way. We all have our images. And sometimes it would become helpful to me if I thought of the artwork of someone that has whittled in the Midwest. I say this as having been born in Connecticut, and I could put a lot of artwork up there, but I have just as many images of the person in Huntingburg, Indiana, that gave me a peach pit and a cherry pit that was whittled and carved, and maybe has stronger images at times. Or the time my mother showed me in the kitchen how to take the fork on the edge of the pie to sculpture the edge of the pie crust before she puts it. Is it possible that sometimes the variety of images can reflect not just what we see in a museum?
Absolutely. And furthermore, not everybody's image-oriented. They might be texture, or smell, or taste, or touch. But absolutely, that's what's so much fun about clinical work, because everything's a new adventure. You don't know what you're going to hear. It isn't repeated. It's very idiosyncratic. And what turns up in a piece of art is what a person with talent, perseverance, and love for the medium has made out of their personal images. But everybody has images. It's like everybody dreaming. It's democratic. Utterly democratic. Though I didn't emphasize enough that not everybody is visual. Some are primarily one of the other senses. And that is, in itself, if you get a whole bunch of texture people, dog's fur, they dream of velvet, the surface of the peach pit, stone, things like that. It's all very different within each sense, really. So, yes.
Anne is nicer than I am. I think it isn't democratic. And I think it is demanding. I'm all for the pie experience and the pit. The Pie and the Pit's a nice title for something. But I think we have to cultivate our senses, all of them. And although we're not all visual at the same level, everybody must learn to see. Since my great blind friend saw so well, I had to learn, watching him, I was so cautioned by it, that he could see in his hearing. He used to play records. Some of you may remember pre-cassette, pre-CD days. There were LPs. And they ran on turntables that had two speeds, the LP speed, which was 33 1/3, and the old speed from the great old breakable shellac, 78 RPM. He used to play 33 1/3 records at 78. But he heard every word. And he saw every image as it flickered by him in that stupendous sound. And he heard the way Gubaidulina heard Christ on the cross. He heard in Wallace Stevens being read at that incredible speed, the slowness and softness. He found his pie and pit in that range of sounds rushing by him. It's not so much that I'm disagreeing with you, I really am not, but I'm saying there's an expansion open to all of us. And we neglect that, I think, at great cost. We have these senses, and if one of the senses collapses on us, as Lenny's did, he couldn't see, not after the age of 7 when the measles got him, then he could see with his ear. And if we've lost some hearing, then we can hear with our fingers, and so forth and so on.
Tell them how he talked about the cigarette.
He said, Anne wanted me to tell you the story, which is absolutely true of Lenny. He said there are 2 kinds of people in the world. He smoked. There are people who hand you a cigarette and light it and drop the match before the cigarette has been able to get started. And there are others who light it for you and never stop until you burn up. He says there are either people who want you to go on fire or people who want the cigarette in your mouth and don't give a damn whether it's lit or not. Now, that's seeing. He wasn't making a terrifying judgment, but he was asking us to see with all our resources. That's what we're talking about. To feel and taste, to understand, to find ourselves in the good odor in which we were conceived. Because the extraordinary thing is that any conception, I've said this in a way glancingly earlier, but it's really true, any conception is good. Any conception. Which is why we don't throw anybody back anymore. You know, one of the wonderful facts of life, I don't know how much more I want to say after this, I'm so moved by this fact of my lifetime. When I grew up, people with cerebral palsy and multiple sclerosis and other of those difficulties were in effect thought to be a waste. Who needed them? They were mocked on the street. Most of you are too young to remember any of this. They were held to be discards, the point Anne has been making so much today. They were the really wastrels of creation. I happen to know well the woman whose daughter had cerebral palsy so badly, Marie Killerly. She wrote a book about it called Karen, and out of that came the United Cerebral Palsy Association. This is just one of them. But now I see their buses all over, especially in New York, and I've had students with it, etc. We don't throw them back. They're real people. They're just as capable of whatever it is they're capable of as any of the rest of us. So it is with the things we see and hear and taste and touch and smell. Use them all. They are the senses even more than of the body of the soul.
I'm both grateful and overwhelmed by the fluidity of the materials that you have shared in your lectures this weekend. That challenged and confronts me. So I'm sitting with Tempest, trying to weigh what to do with it. But in order to display my willingness, in order to experience livingness, I'm sticking my neck out here to ask the question so that my soul can be communicated to the spirit of this community and the community in general. And that is the question relating to the relocating of the spirit and the psyche. Some years ago, I read through John Robinson's book, Honest to God. And in that book, he attempted to relocate God from up there to the depth. Last night and today, I heard about no longer up there, but down and down and down. I guess part of my willingness to take the risk in order to experience livingness is to ask you whether you can help us or how you can help us of how to, or what is our responsibilities for those of us who have the time and the energy to experience going beyond the ego and even beyond that, to those who may not have that capability, to those who may not have that privilege, to those who may not understand what we are trying to communicate.
Everybody dreams. Everybody has images, or textures, or sounds, or tastes, or smells. We're all the same there. Some are more privileged to be exposed than others, but the psyche speaks in all of us the same way. Images, affects, instincts, unconscious, defenses, urge to realization, developmental arrests, problems, neuroses, etc., etc., etc. It's packaged differently according to our cultural location, our location in history, our location in terms of other people, physical health, etc. But what I was trying to convey when I said it changes one's sense of ethics, if one engages in the conversation with oneself, wherever one is, which is going on with people, not just in tried and true ways that come out in official art or official religion, if one can make a safe enough container, in any situation, this level of conversation will appear. I can give you examples of it, of how people have done it. But the shift is, it's no longer those who have and those who don't have. I'm not making simple, cheery goodwill out of inequities of power and privilege and goods. But the psyche's language and the soul's language is something we all share. I think of one example, rather an extreme one. The man is now retired, but there are a few books you can still get by Harry Wilmer, who was a psychiatrist, Jungian analyst in Texas, who worked in a VA hospital for many, many years. And the patients that he writes about in this study were Vietnam veterans. It was a mental hospital, inpatient mental hospital, who suffered for decades from post-traumatic stress disorder and were dysfunctional in society. They couldn't keep a job, keep a temper, keep a diet, keep anything, and they had to be hospitalized. They couldn't keep a sanity. And what he discovered, which was extraordinary when you think about it, is these men, some of whom had not slept through the night for over a decade because their nightmares from their combat in Vietnam was so vivid and horrible and repeated that they just woke up screaming, living the same thing again. He went for their dreams. No one had ever asked about these dreams. He was a Jungian, so he was very interested in them. He didn't do the usual kind of interpretive thing that you might do in another setting, another cultural location. What he did was fashion dream groups so that there was an inner circle of men and an outer circle of men, and one of the men each time would tell his nightmare, which were terrible. I won't burden you with them. You've all heard of these atrocities and things. And then there'd be silence. There'd be no interpretation. Then Harry would ask the man to repeat it again. Then Harry would repeat the dream. And then the man would repeat it again. And then the inner circle and the outer circle, they'd change. Now what happened over that time, that's a very severe setting. It's an inpatient mental hospital, men who are really dysfunctional, who are exhausted, full of this trauma. What happened, the psyche was given a chance. It was witnessed. That's all it was. It was heard. There were no interpretations made. Very gradually over the months, The psyche, because it was recognized and witnessed, started to play with the images, so that it was no longer a literal repetition of the traumatic incident in the dream. The dream ego started moving around. Then Harry was in the dream. Then one of the other men was in the dream. And when that started, the psyche was beginning to work. I would suggest this to them as a possibility. Somebody asked about working with incarcerated prisoners. That's another place this has worked. That's an answer, not the answer. It's one of many.
Just let me say, I think we have two people lined up to speak, and we'll let those be the last two.
We definitely have a third up there.
That was a good question and response, and also the application to the person when working in an incarcerating institution. Much of what you've said, though, has really been individualized or in the context of the therapeutic relationship. Now, some of us still are participants in things called congregations, and I wonder what kind of comments you could make with regard to how what you have been saying last night and today, sharing helpfully, but in what way have you seen some applications of what you've been saying occurring, sprouting in life of congregations, for which some of us still have some hope?
And my question was going to be a more Jungian one. You started out saying that you thought somewhat disparagingly, I think, that the sense of spirit was coming down.
No, not disparagingly.
Oh, okay.
That's just where one finds it.
But as this gentleman and the fellow here, talked about the changes in our images, in the God image, Jung and more recently Edward Edinger spent a good portion of the last part of their lives working on the issues of the transformations of the God image. And they would say on an individual level, doing your own work is really important. And it goes with his question, on a collective level, if you've reflected on that, or having advice or suggestions on what we can do as part of our community.
Thank you. You want to go first?
There is no straightforward answer, certainly no formulaic answer. I think you have to be guided by what is so central to all education, exposure. If we feel, as this gentleman suggested, as certainly I feel, congregations are worth the effort, they should have a chance much more often than they do in most cases to hear, to see, and even to taste, etc., what's in the world of the Spirit. There should be much more sharing at a much more adventurous level. It doesn't happen often enough. In the churches I know from around the world where this has been most successful, and some of them are not Christian churches, some of them are what I've seen in India and Southeast Asia, I'm enormously impressed that they exist at all. They've dared some of the kind of music that I tried to play today, and at least a sample today, and an imagery in words as often as in works of art, and an encouragement even to say silly things about this, but to feel that they're part of the whole world of the Spirit. There is much more of what is called the social gospel in our churches than there is of what I would call the art gospel, which is the more impressive to me because it includes all other gospels, including the social. There is a plentiful rhetoric of concern for the misbegotten, the badly used, and all the rest, and that's splendid. But I'm afraid, though it raises money occasionally and provokes a certain amount of outrage, it doesn't share in the way that, foolishly or not, I believe stubbornly, the arts and related occupations with the resources of the human permit us to share. That, I think, is something we must do. Our congregations are worthy if we are worthy. If our spiritual undertakings, reading, looking, hearing, whatever it may be, have substance, then certainly we should share them.
I have quite a strong reaction. I want to correct if you thought I was being disparaging about the Spirit being down. No, it's just where it is. and that down is not bad. But my strong reaction is stated this way: I don't think the church is going to have a future in the 21st century if it neglects the psyche and the arts. So I'd certainly agree with Barry in terms of exposure. And the riches in the Christian tradition are untold. The theologies, the imagery, the different ways of worshiping over history. There have been a number of books recently, Jesus Through the Ages, Mary Through the Ages. You get all these different communities having different lenses on religious objects, if you like. I think we need much more food, more protein in the churches, more study groups, if you like. I think also it's that we must not underestimate the fact of the spirit and the fact that the psychic reality is really real. So that even if I were the pastor and I did nothing overt, but I was struggling in my own life with my conversation between surface and depth mind, between subjective God images, objective God images, and God as the objective subject. If I'm just doing that, it will change something in the air. Why? Because the psyche isn't just in me. It's between me, it's in you, it's between us, it's all around us. We are in the psyche, we are in the spirit. Similarly, if I'm struggling in my own praying, even if I do nothing else for my congregation, that will get into the air. I sit in the pew as a lay person, and as Evelyn Underhill says, you know in a minute whether this woman or this man's for real or not. You just smell it. And if they're struggling, you can struggle. If they're risking, you can risk. Now, another thing to say, which may also seem strong, I do believe in the good works of the church, the Habitat for Humanity, the outreach, the soup kitchens, and so on. But I don't think they're the main work of the church. And often social agencies do them better, because the church really is the home of the lame, the halt, and the blind, and we're not awfully good at this stuff. Other people are usually better because they're trained to do it. I always go back to Iris Murdoch's notion of goodness. What is goodness good for? It's good for nothing. What is the church as an institution in society? It's the one place in the collective consciousness, the collective ego consciousness, where there is weekly, if not daily, acknowledgement that there is a real reality beyond us. It's like a hole into another world. It's the witnessing. It's the leaven in the lump. That's the main work. And it isn't good for anything. We can go on doing our good works. Those are byproducts. Not because we're helper to helpee. The implied hubris in that makes my hair go out in curls. It's the same thing in psychoanalytic theory, that somehow the mutative agent of transformation, this is all the babble-bobble we get into, is that you interject the analyst in place of your dear old mother. Well, who's to say the analyst is any better than your dear old mother was? And people who work with children sometimes say they have an abusive parent, and they say, do you want me to find you a new mummy? And the little girl says, no, I want my own mummy. So I don't think that the idea of helping the other always implies somehow we have more. And in world's terms, maybe, but maybe not in spiritual terms. It's a whole other democracy on this slime level. So down to the slime. Goodness is good for nothing. and struggle with your own, and it will be like magic. It goes out. As a person who sat in a pew for 100 years, I can tell you, it makes all the difference. You're fed or you're not fed, and you go away hungry.
Just one word, sanctuary. One thing that religion and concern to heal must always offer is sanctuary. That ancient idea, and I know so many tales out of bygone millennia, when people knew they had one place they can go to no matter what they had done, no matter what they were missing. That's enough for me.
I have read and heard that illness comes in one's life to help make us whole, and I would like to hear from each of you your perspectives on illness as transformational power.
Oh, that's so difficult. Of course you're right, and isn't it horrible that you are? I mean, illness is the pits. You don't want to be ill. Pain hurts. You want to be better. You want to be healthy in mind, body, and soul. Illness is dreadful. If we can run away from it, give me some sneakers. That, I think, is the animal in us that's healthy and right and that says, ugh. But if you have the stamina, and who has stamina when they're sick? Something advances on the horizon. Some meaning begins to congregate. It needs the ego to be looking out for it. And some people feel, the blessed people feel, if they get well, or even if they don't get well, if it weren't for this, I never would have seen that. That is said over and over and over again. Now, psychodynamically, it may be the ego is so tight, so efficient, so robust, that the only way it can be brought to see something beyond itself is with a big punch in the nose, or the heart, or the intestine, or the knee. I'm not one of those, and it's enraging, I think. It's an insult on top of injury that thinks all physical illness can be reduced to the wrong mental attitude. I think that's just sadistic. However, I do think you can always ask, what's the meaning of this psychologically? What can I learn from this? And that's a very tough question to ask when we're sick.